The night he threw my clothes onto the cold driveway, I realized just how invisible he thought I was. I stood there in silence while shirts, dresses, and shoes landed at my feet like garbage. The mansion lights behind him glowed brightly, almost like the house itself was laughing at me. His new girlfriend stood beside him, arms crossed, lips curved into a smug little smile. "Take your stuff and get out," he said loudly, making sure she heard every word. "You don't belong here anymore." The wind carried the sound of his voice across the empty street. I bent down slowly and picked up my jacket, dusting it off like none of this mattered. But inside, something cracked. 3 years. 3 years of cooking in that kitchen, organizing the rooms, paying bills he never even noticed. 3 years of believing we were building something together. But now he was standing in the doorway of my house, acting like I was the guest. His girlfriend glanced at me like I was something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "Wow," she said, laughing softly. "You didn't tell me she was still hanging around." He shrugged. "She just doesn't get the hint." I could have argued. I could have screamed. But I didn't. Instead, I carefully folded the sweater he had just thrown outside and placed it into my suitcase. The silence confused them. He expected tears. Maybe begging. But patience has always been my strongest weapon. When I finished packing, I stood up and looked at him for the first time that night. He leaned against the doorway like some kind of king standing over his kingdom. "You're really kicking me out?" I asked quietly. He smirked. "It's my house." That sentence almost made me laugh. Almost. His girlfriend stepped forward, clearly enjoying the moment. She looked around the massive driveway, the tall iron gates, the marble steps leading to the front doors. "Honestly," she said to him, loud enough for me to hear, "I don't know how you stayed with someone like her in a place like this." I zipped my suitcase slowly. Then I pulled my phone out. "Just one question," I said calmly. He rolled his eyes. "What?" I tapped a number and put the phone on speaker. The call connected quickly. "Good evening, Carter," the voice on the other end said politely. I watched his face carefully. "Daniel," I replied. "Quick question. Who owns the property at 17 Hawthorne Ridge?" There was a small pause. Then Daniel answered. "You do, mime." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to break the ground beneath us. His girlfriend's smile disappeared first. Then his. "What?" he said, frowning. I ended the call slowly and slid the phone back into my pocket. "You remember 3 years ago," I said calmly, "when you told me your credit was terrible and you couldn't buy a house?" His expression shifted. Confusion. Then worry. "I bought it," I continued. "In my name. Because the bank wouldn't approve you." His girlfriend turned to him slowly. "You told me you bought this place." He didn't answer. I walked toward the front steps, suitcase rolling behind me. For the first time that night, I stepped past him instead of away from him. He moved aside automatically, like his body finally understood what his brain hadn't yet processed. Inside, the marble floor echoed under my footsteps. The same floor I had chosen. The same walls I had painted. The same house he had just tried to throw me out of. I turned around and looked at both of them standing in the doorway. "You're right about one thing," I said softly. "Someone doesn't belong here." His girlfriend crossed her arms again, but now she looked uncertain. "You're lying," she said. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin folder. "Property documents." I handed them to her. She flipped through the pages quickly. Her eyes scanned the name printed on every line. "Mine." Slowly, she lowered the papers. "You said this was your house," she whispered to him. His face had gone pale. It basically is?" he stammered. She looked at him like she had never seen him before. Then she handed the folder back to me. "I don't date liars," she said coldly. And just like that, she walked down the steps, past the pile of clothes he had thrown outside, and disappeared through the gates. The sound of her car leaving echoed down the quiet street. For the first time all night, he looked small. He turned to me. "Wait, listen, I didn't mean." But I raised my hand. "No," I said calmly. The same word he had used earlier. Only this time it carried weight. "I think you should take your stuff," I added, glancing toward the front door. "Hard get out." His mouth opened slightly. "You're serious?" I stepped aside and gestured toward the driveway where my clothes still lay scattered. "You started this conversation." For a long moment he didn't move. Then reality finally settled in. He walked past me slowly, down the steps, across the driveway that he thought belonged to him. I watched from the doorway while he picked up the same suitcase he had thrown minutes earlier. The same humiliation, the same silence. But this time, it wasn't morning after. I walked through the halls of the mansion like it was my runway. Every room carried a memory of what I had built, what I had endured, and what I had quietly mastered. Sunlight spilled across the polished floors, highlighting the expensive rugs he had bragged about decorating. Only now, I could enjoy them without feeling small, without feeling like an intruder in my own life. I passed the living room, where the sofa still smelled faintly of the expensive cologne he thought defined him. I paused and ran my fingers along the cushions. 3 years of shared life, 3 years of patience, and now it was mine, not just the house, but the power that came from knowing the truth. Later that day, his calls started. Silent numbers, missed calls, texts that rang with desperation. Can we talk? I can fix this. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at them. I had no intention of letting him back into my life, or my mansion. Word spread fast. By evening, I saw neighbors whispering, glancing curiously toward the gates. I caught snippets of conversations. Didn't you hear? She owns the place. I can't believe he thought he could throw her out. The irony stung, but in the best way possible. Then came the final touch. I called my lawyer, someone I had trusted to keep everything official, and asked them to schedule a small gathering, a house tour for prospective buyers who were friends of mine, people he had always wanted to impress. When the day came, he showed up. He said he had come to apologize. I let him walk in, showing him the same grandeur he had always admired, but never truly respected. The air was thick with tension. I noticed how his eyes darted to every corner, how he realized the furniture, the fixtures, the entire house, everything, bore my signature, my choices, my money. The visitors arrived. People laughed, commented on the elegance, admired his smugness faltered with every compliment they gave me. He tried to interject, to claim influence, to act like he had any part in this. But no one listened. I didn't need to say a word. Silence carried me through every room, louder than any shout he could manage. Finally, as the tour ended, he turned to me, voice low, almost pleading. I thought we built this together. I smiled, calm, collected. You built illusions. I built reality. He looked around helplessly. The mansion that had always been his fantasy had always been mine in truth. The final humiliation wasn't loud. It was absolute. Every whispered conversation, every glance, every moment of respect he thought he commanded had evaporated. And me. I stood tall, holding the keys to a life he never owned. I had waited, I had watched. I had let patience do the work that anger never could. By nightfall, the house was quiet. The driveway empty. The piles of clothes he had tossed were gone, cleaned up, folded back in the closets. I walked through the rooms one last time, savoring the quiet victory. Revenge had never been about anger or destruction. It had been about presence, about timing, about letting the truth speak for itself. And now, the mansion didn't just belong to me. It belonged to my patience, my dignity, my intelligence. He had tried to make me feel small. He had tried to humiliate me in front of the world. But in the end, he had only made me stronger. And as I closed the front door, locking it behind me for the first time with absolute certainty, I whispered into the empty halls, "This is mine. No one could take it from me, not him, not anyone." The mansion stood silently, as proud and untouchable as I felt, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to smile without restraint. This wasn't just revenge. This was next morning. I woke to the sound of birds outside the windows, sunlight spilling into every corner of the mansion. I poured myself coffee and walked out onto the terrace, looking over the gardens I had designed, the fountains I had insisted on, the paths I had carefully mapped. Everything was in its place, exactly as I had envisioned. For years, he had thought he ruled this house. Now it was a fortress of my making, and I was the undisputed owner, not just of property, but of every secret, every memory, every silent victory that had built me to this moment. I didn't need to gloat. The world already knew. Within hours, news had quietly spread through social circles. She owns the mansion. He tried to kick her out. She didn't even raise her voice. The whispers carried more weight than any argument. Every acquaintance he had hoped to impress now looked at him differently. And every glance in my direction carried a subtle admiration, a recognition that what I had done wasn't just clever, it was flawless. He tried again, of course. I received a text later that day. I made a mistake. Can we talk? I didn't respond. Instead, I replied with action. I called the interior designer we had both worked with, confirming an exclusive redesign meeting. I scheduled contractors to work on parts of the mansion he had bragged about decorating. Every time he tried to insert himself, I moved the pieces of my life silently, strategically, untouchably. By the next week, even the staff he had once relied on to keep the house in order were all on my side. They had watched him fail to recognize my contributions for years, watched him throw my things out, watched him humiliate me. Now, they followed my instructions without question, quietly reinforcing the truth I was in charge. I was the owner. I was the final authority. One evening, I invited a few close friends for a casual dinner. He showed up unexpectedly, hoping, I'm sure, to salvage a shred of his pride. I let him in, out of courtesy, not forgiveness. He looked around, tense, as if the walls themselves were reminding him that nothing here was his. My friends greeted him politely, but the admiration in their eyes was reserved for me. He tried to dominate conversation, tried to retell stories of his contributions to the house, but I let him speak. I watched his stories unravel, noticed how easily people saw through them. Every exaggeration, every half-truth, every boast fell flat. And when he finally realized no one was listening, his face went pale. I poured a glass of wine and raised it lightly. To what's real, I said quietly, looking around the room. My friends smiled, knowing exactly what I meant. He swallowed nervously. He knew, at that moment, that nothing could redeem him in this space. Later, when he left, he didn't slam the door. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked out, defeated, quietly acknowledging the truth. He had been outplayed. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, letting the silence fill the mansion. It was heavy, sure, but it was mine. Every inch of it. Every echo. Every shadow. From that day on, the mansion was more than just walls and furniture. It was a symbol of patience, resilience, and strategic brilliance. Every time I walked through the rooms, I remembered that he had tried to humiliate me, to make me feel small. And every time, I smiled to myself, knowing that the one who truly owned this place was me. Months later, I hosted a small garden party. Neighbors, friends, acquaintances, all came. He wasn't invited. And if he had seen the photos later, the smiles, the laughter, the effortless elegance of a life he had thought he controlled, I can only imagine the sting. But that was his problem. For me, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about living, thriving, and savoring the quiet, undeniable truth. Patience had its reward, dignity had its power, and intelligence had its triumph. As the sun set behind the mansion that night, casting golden light across the fountains and gardens, I stood on the terrace and breathed in deeply. The air smelled like freedom, like victory, like everything I had earned through quiet strength. He had thrown my clothes onto the driveway to humiliate me. But in the end, he had thrown himself into irrelevance. And I was untouchable. The mansion, my name on the deed, the keys in my hand, it wasn't just property. It was proof that patience, strategy, and unwavering self-belief can turn humiliation into absolute, undeniable power. I had won. Completely. And the silence of that mansion wasn't empty, it was full of winter. I decided it was time to make the mansion even more unmistakably mine. I hired landscapers to redesign the gardens entirely, giving the driveway a winding path lined with olive trees and lights that glowed softly at night. I commissioned art for the walls, pieces that reflected my taste, my vision, my story. Every detail was a quiet announcement to the world: this house, this life, this legacy, belonged to me. He tried to appear again, at a charity event held in the mansion's grand ballroom. He had assumed I would be embarrassed, humiliated, maybe even run out of the room. Instead, I entered confidently, dressed elegantly, the very picture of control. My friends and acquaintances immediately gravitated toward me, introducing me as the owner, the host, the force behind the mansion. I noticed him shrink under the weight of recognition. Not because I said anything, but because the truth spoke louder than words ever could. He lingered at the edge of the room, hoping someone would ask him about the house, hoping to salvage a trace of credibility. No one did. He was invisible. Later, I invited my closest friends and some of the neighbors for a private dinner in the mansion's library. The fireplace was lit, casting warm light on the mahogany shelves filled with books I had carefully selected over the years. We laughed, shared stories, and celebrated small victories. Every glance, every word, every acknowledgement reinforced one undeniable fact: I was not just the owner of the mansion, I was the orchestrator of every outcome, every success, every subtle triumph. He tried one last time, sending a message of, "Can we talk? I want to explain." I read it once, smiled faintly, and deleted it. Explanation meant nothing anymore. His moment of power had passed. Every attempt at control had crumbled quietly, perfectly. Months went by, and life in the mansion felt surreal. Friends visited, events were hosted, and the space became a sanctuary of laughter, warmth, and achievement. People admired it, yes, but more importantly, they admired me, the woman who had turned humiliation into mastery, who had transformed patience into victory. Then, one quiet evening, I walked through the mansion alone, lit only by the soft glow of chandeliers and the moonlight spilling through the large windows. I paused in the main hall, looking at the staircase where he had once stood so arrogantly, throwing my clothes like trash. The memory stung for just a second, then vanished, replaced by satisfaction. I realized then that revenge doesn't need fireworks, it doesn't need drama. True revenge is quiet, patient, and invisible until the payoff is absolute. The mansion was no longer just a building. It was a statement. It was proof that power lies not in aggression, but in strategy, in self-control, and in the ability to endure. From that day on, every visitor, every friend, every neighbor understood one truth without me ever saying it: the mansion, and everything within it, was mine. He had tried to erase me, to humiliate me, to make me vanish. But I had turned every insult, every slight, every attempt at domination into fuel. And now I stood unshakable. The mansion was alive with my presence. Every echo, every hallway, every polished surface whispered my triumph. I walked past the rooms I had designed, past the garden I had envisioned, past the fountains I had insisted upon, and I finally allowed myself to feel complete. I hadn't just reclaimed a house. I had reclaimed my dignity, my power, my life. And as the moonlight hit the front gates, I smiled. He had thrown my clothes out to humiliate me, but he had only thrown himself into irrelevance. And I was untouchable. The mansion stood in silent glory, a fortress of patience, strategy, and absolute victory. And I had never felt freer, or more turned into months. And the mansion became more than just a home. It became a fortress of my success, a living testament to patience, strategy, and quiet dominance. Every corner, every chandelier, every tile echoed my story. The story of someone underestimated, humiliated, and dismissed, who refused to react in anger, and instead built a power that was absolute. I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. People who once nodded politely at him now glanced at me with recognition, respect, even awe. He would drive past occasionally, probably hoping to see someone, a trace of the person he once thought he could control. I never acknowledged him. Never waved. Never even glanced his way. Silence was my final weapon, my final victory. Then came the day I decided to host a grand winter gala, inviting prominent friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. The house sparkled like a jewel in the cold night, every hallway lit, every room alive with warmth and laughter. I descended the grand staircase in a gown I had chosen months earlier, the one I had dreamed of wearing for this exact moment. Cameras flashed, people whispered, and I felt every eye on me, but not because I demanded attention. Because I had earned it. He tried to show up, of course. A part of me expected him to. But when he saw the crowd, the recognition, the admiration, all directed at me, he stopped cold at the gates. I watched him through the tall windows, small, insignificant, realizing that no matter how close he came, he would never enter my world again. Later that night, as the gala wound down and the last of the guests left, I wandered alone through the mansion. The winter moon cast silver shadows across the floors, highlighting the elegance I had created. I paused at the library, where the fireplace still glowed faintly. The memory of him throwing my clothes outside, trying to assert dominance, came back for a moment, but it was distant now, a shadow of a shadow. I ran my hand over the smooth spines of the books I had chosen, the desk where I had signed every important document, the stair railing I had polished to perfection. Every inch of this place whispered one truth I had endured. I had waited, and I had won. And the best part, he had done it himself. By trying to humiliate me, he had only revealed my strength, my foresight, my control. As I stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace and moonlight, I realized something important: revenge isn't about destruction. It isn't about confrontation. It's about building something so solid, so undeniable, that the person who tried to tear you down is left powerless, irrelevant, and invisible. And in that silence, in that absolute control, the victory is complete. I walked through the mansion one last time before retiring for the night. Doors locked. Security systems active. Every corner exactly as I wanted. The mansion wasn't just a home. It was a declaration. A warning. A statement to anyone who might ever doubt me again, underestimate me, humiliate me, dismiss me. and you will see the quiet power of patience, intelligence, and strategy. He had thrown my clothes onto the driveway to assert dominance, to impress someone else, to prove a point. But in the end, he had only thrown himself into irrelevance. And me. I was untouchable. The mansion stood silently in the snow, lights glowing softly against the dark sky. Every echo, every creak, every shadow carried my victory. Every window reflected the woman who had endured, who had waited, who had reclaimed not just her home, but her dignity, her power, and her life. And in that silence, I finally smiled. Because for the first time in years, I felt entirely free, entirely untouchable, entirely